This is the third in a short series of videos responding to Liana K's gish-galloping rant to anti-feminists, to which I've linked in the low bar so that anyone can see what I'm responding to. The first and second videos in this series are also linked in the low bar. In this video, I'll be addressing Liana's statements about the men's rights movement. And as I've said before, Liana, I'm aware that you'll probably never address any of these criticisms, because you're too busy denying that they exist and shouting at straw men instead. But I'm going to respond to your claims anyway. So, let's start down the line of men's rights advocate grievances which you so casually dismissed. The modern men's rights movement began with the fathers' rights movement, which exists because of discrimination against fathers in family court. This discrimination is a result of law and policy changes that trace back nearly 200 years, when 19th century feminist Carolyn Norton's activism led to change in English common law, which in turn was the inspiration for the tender years doctrine in U.S. law. Mothers in the U.S. get custody over 80% of the time. This also results in mothers receiving child support awards much more often. Even when fathers do receive support, they receive less. Fathers' rights groups have proposed and lobbied for reform in the form of laws that would make equally shared parenting the default in uncontested divorce, and for more even-handed treatment of child support obligation. Feminists have directly opposed these efforts using demonization of fathers as deadbeats and abusers, and false representation of equally shared parenting bills as every case imperatives to persuade the public to oppose them and legislators to vote against them. As always, there will be links for this in the low bar. I've linked to previous sourced writing and a video I've produced to highlight the path that I've just described. Before accusing me of self-citation, please refer to the sources I've cited in those articles in that video. Liana, if you don't think provable discrimination against fathers, and by extension their children, is a legitimate grievance, I'd be very interested to know your justification. Do you support feminist groups which lobby against initiatives for reforming custody law? If so, I'd be very interested to hear your justification for that as well. Another of the movement's main grievances is discrimination against male victims of female perpetrators under laws related to intimate partner and sexual violence. The majority of these discriminatory laws seems to have been informed by the U.S.'s Gender Discriminatory Violence Against Women Act, which was passed under pressure by feminist lobbyists who used skewed statistics from deliberately biased research to advocate for it. The Violence Against Women Act replaced the Gender-Neutral Family Violence Services and Protection Act of 1984. Among the changes VAWA put into place were a removal of services for men and boys over the age of 12 or 13 from federally funded domestic violence shelters. Abused men seeking help today at American shelters are more likely to be treated as perpetrators and receive information on anger management courses than to get help escaping their abuser. VAWA contains sexist, female-specific language, funding for deliberately biased research designed to justify its policies, and further funding designed to influence law enforcement, prosecutors, and the judicial system by incentivizing arrest, conviction, harsh sentencing, and sentence enforcement. It also contains funding to incentivize identification of victims and pursuit of action against accused perpetrators. In other words, it's incentivizing finding victims. Updates have introduced funding for female-oriented victims advocacy programs designed to further influence law enforcement, and it has expanded the definition of domestic abuse. This is not a gender-neutral law with problems caused at the law enforcement end. This is a gender-specific law with problems written into its design so that no part of the legal system has any choice but to apply it in an entirely sexist fashion. There will be links in the low bar to sourced articles and videos that I and others have produced, which demonstrate that there is discrimination against men and boys in this area under the law, and which show feminist groups lobbying has both made this worse than it was under traditional attitudes and exploited traditional attitudes to prevent legal reform. If you believe that equal treatment and representation under criminal law is not a right, I would be fascinated to hear your justification for that. If you think it is, but violation of that right is not a legitimate grievance, or that abused men don't need the same resources that abused women need, I'd be even more fascinated to hear your justification for that. I am also waiting to hear what psychological supports in male-dominated areas you think make a sufficient substitute for equal legal recourse for male victims of sexual violence by female perpetrators. Do you not think they might feel a bit more supported if they knew their perpetrators would at least face the same type and degree of penalty they would face if the roles were reversed? Next is a related grievance: due process in criminal cases, which is a human right. Men's rights activists fight for two things in this area. One is the preservation of due process itself, including the defendant's right to face his accuser in a court of law, his right to present exculpatory evidence, and his right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. These rights are particularly infringed by sexual violence laws intended to ease the process for accusers. If you're ever accused of a crime, Liana, do you think you would be okay with having psychological support substituted for your right to present exculpatory evidence? How about if we presume you guilty, but provide you with psychological support for the way having to prove your innocence without all of the available evidence affects your outlook? When are you going to volunteer for that? The other men's rights battle in this area is for false accuser violations of the process to be taken seriously and responded to as the criminal acts they are. When an accusation is proved demonstrably false, and in the course of the case the accuser committed a crime, like filing a false police report or committing perjury, that is as much a violation of the defendant's rights as it would have been a violation of the accuser's rights if the defendant had actually committed the crime. I'm sure, given your supposition that MRA grievances don't have anything to do with rights, that you wouldn't consider your rights violated if someone used lies on the witness stand to try to get you convicted of a crime you didn't commit. Surely you would not consider yourself discriminated against if you knew during the hearing that lying on the stand in your own defense would get you tried for and possibly convicted of perjury, but your accuser could lie in support of his case with impunity simply because of his sex and the nature of his accusation. That'd be okay, wouldn't it, Liana? No? Sounds like you need a little psychological support. Equality in sentencing and treatment while in government custody is another area of men's rights advocacy. And we don't have to see it go a specific direction. Simply put, if the aspects of an accusation are the same, then the response should be the same, and the conditions that response entails should also be the same. If shorter sentences are sufficient when women commit violent or sexual crimes, the same should be true when those crimes are committed by men. And if psychological support can be substituted for punishment in women's cases, it should be equally sufficient in men's. If custodial parenthood is a reason for leniency in a case against a female perpetrator, it should be the same if the perpetrator is a custodial dad. If solitary confinement is too inhumane to inflict on women, it's too inhumane to inflict on men. Of course, this all goes back to equal treatment under the law. I don't know how Canada views this, but in the United States, it's a constitutionally protected right. Do you think it should be abolished? If so, again, what's your justification? Another area of unequal treatment under the law is choice in reproductive and parental responsibility. Women not only have the lion's share of birth control choices and the option to abort, we also have safe haven abandonment as an option, and adoption. With these options available, becoming a single custodial mother is a choice. One the mother's right to make is protected by law. In fact, the right to safe haven abandonment exists because women have committed infanticide to avoid parental responsibility, and society would rather have another way out than have to repeatedly face how brutal of an act that is. The men's rights movement would like to see fathers have a choice that is equal to mothers' right to safe haven abandonment, paternal surrender, which would be an act of cutting ties and would prevent any child support obligation. When it was standard for men to have custody of their kids, women weren't expected to pay child support. The reason back then was because of the difference in men's and women's earning capacities. That difference doesn't exist anymore. There is no reason now why child support should not be a voluntary system determined by contract between the parents, governed by contract law, with no state enforcement beyond that provided by any other contract. Even so, that's not what most MRAs are arguing for. All they want is for men to have a period of time equal to the amount of time a woman has to decide whether or not to take parental responsibility and the right to refuse it, thereby exempting themselves of any financial responsibility during that time, if they so choose. Women's argument for abortion instead of abandonment or adoption is the 9 months a woman has to spend pregnant if she cannot abort. If a man has no equal right to abandonment, that's 18 or more years of financial obligation through which his job choices can be dictated by a judge, and he faces jail, essentially debtor's prison, if he does not earn what he's told to earn and pay what he's told to pay. This gives women the legal right to use parental status to command a man's labor for 18 years, or the state the right to use parental status to place a man in the physical jeopardy that a man is in when he is in jail. You wouldn't substitute psychological support for reproductive rights where women are concerned. I'll bet you also wouldn't deny that reproductive rights are a legitimate issue when something like abortion or safe haven abandonment are under discussion. And I'm pretty sure you wouldn't impose a child support obligation on women using safe haven abandonment that is equal to the one a man would face if a woman chooses to keep custody of a baby he doesn't want to parent. And I'll bet that you would argue to most men who are pro-life that if they don't have a uterus, they're not really entitled to determine whether or not abortion is a legitimate women's issue. Likewise, you're not really entitled to determine for the rest of us whether the reproductive choice gap is a legitimate grievance. And while we're on the topic of equal bodily autonomy for the sexes, there's also intactivism, an issue that the movement is divided on. But a large contingent of us believe that the right to genital integrity is a genderless right. The basic position is that genital cutting does not benefit children. There is no reason compelling enough to override the individual's right to make that choice in adulthood, regardless of that person's sex. An adult has the right to make that decision for him or herself, but not for a child, and the practice really should be outlawed. This position is recognized as correct and compelling where girls are concerned, and cutting the genitals of underage girls is outlawed throughout most of the world. But the same is not true for boys. In fact, it's a pretty big business here in the United States, so heavily supported that a judge recently ordered a parent to consent to having it done to her little boy against the child's stated wishes. So, I'd like to know, Liana, do you really think bodily autonomy rights overall are not a legitimate grievance? Do you think the right to control one's own body should be based on the individual's sex? These are major grievances that have to do with legally protected rights. All of them boil down to equal protection and treatment under the law. There are other issues the movement addresses that are not law-related grievances, and other reasons we criticize feminists. But if I get into that, I'll be responding to your bullshit forever. So let's move on. Your statements about abortion are not really honest. You're characterizing a controversy over who women have the right to legally force to pay for their abortions as a controversy over whether abortion should be legal. As abortion itself isn't really a men's issue aside from the fact that it represents a woman's right to unilaterally decide whether a couple's conceived baby will or will not be born, I'm not going to make a long statement on the nature of the abortion controversy. There are a variety of different positions on this topic, both among the MRM and antifeminists, and even among feminists. And for that reason, nobody in any of these groups can truly speak for anyone else in any group. Instead, I'm going to talk about the fact that the kind of false framing that pro-abortion feminists put on the issue is yet another reason there are anti-feminists. None of what I'm about to say is either an endorsement of abortion or a statement of opposition to it. I'm simply pointing out the intellectual dishonesty of pro-abortion feminists' approach to discussing this issue. I'm going to just say feminists from here on out because it's easier, but once again I do acknowledge that not all feminists are pro-abortion. So for feminists who are anti-abortion and listening to this, the rest of this is not about you. First of all, calling it a women's issue does not override the right of women to oppose widespread use of the procedure, nor does it delegitimize arguments women who oppose abortion make. Framing it as a woman's bodily autonomy issue does not eliminate the right of anyone to consider the body of the fetus equally important in their arguments. It only makes your arguments less persuasive to people arguing from that perspective. Feminism is not the arbiter of whether one or the other of those perspectives is the right perspective for a woman to adopt. Abortion industry supporters are not the arbiters of what is right or wrong for women. Once again, feminism does not own this issue. You do not own women. Discussing the issue as if giving birth automatically translates into single custodial motherhood, despite the other options which exist, is intellectually dishonest. Discussing the issue as if a woman only has access to something she wants if another entity besides the woman herself pays for it is false framing and sexist because it presumes women less capable of working for a living and budgeting their income than men are. Discussing the issue as if the only choice a woman makes between her first glance at a man and putting her feet in the stirrups on the abortionist table is the decision to have the abortion is also intellectually dishonest and sexist. It infers that women are unable to be accountable for weighing risks and options until after it's too late and they're pregnant, which in turn leads to the conclusion that women are inferior to men, who are expected by the same feminists who make this argument to be prepared for non-custodial fatherhood with child support obligation or keep their dicks in their pants. It's extremely hypocritical for feminists who stress the role of sex in leading to parental responsibility when debating parental surrender to discuss abortion as if pregnancy is a surprise curse bestowed by the knock-up fairy. It's ridiculous to argue as if women don't know the same thing men are expected to know when we drop our drawers. It's one thing to debate whether or not that delegitimizes pro-abortion arguments. It's another to pretend it's not a detail that is a valid part of the debate. It's not misogynistic to say that women can be and should be as responsible and accountable for all of our choices as men are expected to be with theirs. It's also embarrassing to women everywhere when you use the misogyny card as a cutoff response to advocacy for the abortion industry to meet the same standards for quality of care, cleanliness, and consideration for patients' rights as any other facet of the healthcare industry. If there are valid, rational arguments why it should be exempt, then those should be offered in debate. If standards are being advocated unequally, win that part of the debate by showing evidence of what standards are for equivalent procedures. The misogyny card is always an invalid argument in the political arena. A lot of women find it insulting to our intelligence. In fact, we will dismiss your concerns the minute you substitute it for a real point, regardless of where we fall in the abortion debate. Next, you whine, some people in power still don't believe that a woman can be raped by her own husband. That's a very, very thin argument when the law protects women regardless of relationship status, but feminists have convinced the United States Centers for Disease Control to use, in research that informs the creation of law and policy, a definition of rape written specifically to exclude male victims of female perpetrators. Whine all you want about not having control over other people's beliefs, but don't expect any sympathy from anti-feminists as long as 1. Beliefs you don't like aren't getting marital rape legalized, and 2. You do nothing to oppose the deliberate effort by feminists to marginalize male victims of female perpetrators. You whine, we still have cops telling women that the risk of rape is based on how they dress. No, actually, there's one cop who said one thing, almost but not quite like that, several years ago, and years of feminists responding to other assertions as if they're that. The argument that being dressed to seduce makes saying that you didn't intend to do so a less credible claim is not a statement that dressing slutty gets you raped or even makes you deserving of it. Exaggerating minority opinions and straw-manning rational arguments are two things that make feminists completely unpersuasive to the rest of us in debate. This is why people like me mock slutwalkers. You have the audacity to follow this up with, these are legitimate denial of rights. Okay, so let me get this straight. Merely having and being able to state an opinion you don't like is a denial of women's rights, even if many women disagree with your opinion. But the issues I described when going over some of the major grievances which inform men's rights activism all of which represent actually unequal treatment under the law, aren't legitimate? And you don't understand why anti-feminists mock you? Maybe it's because that is what the vast overwhelming majority of feminists sound like. Framing your sense of entitlement to never be disagreed with as if others who don't cater to it are irrational and unreasonable makes you look really childish. And with that, I think you've had enough for one video. I've gone really long and hard with this one, and we all know feminists don't like it long and hard. So I will bid you farewell with this. In my next video, I will start with your grudging acknowledgement that men can be victimized, after which you proceed to totally drop the ball.